Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the timekeeper for this part, for the beginning of our afternoon time together. Lisa keeps the clock at the other end very, very firmly. So glad you're here. Welcome to some of you who may have been here for one of the other two sessions. And for those of you who are new, welcome also. I'm happy to say that our sessions are being taped. And so you will be able to catch up on anything that you missed and also revisit some of these talks. The two have been completely fabulous so far, and I know that today will be as well. My name is Franny Eberhardt. I'm the president of Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts, and we are a 38-year-old organization dedicated to the architectural legacy, livability, and sense of place of the Upper East Side. We are a 38-year-old organization, which means that we've been working on this city and suburban case almost from the beginning of our existence, all those many years ago. I want to thank the Department of Cultural Affairs, who's responsible for some of the funding of this event, in partnership with the City Council, and particularly with Ben Kalos, who is City Council member for much of the Upper East Side, and is a great supporter of us and also deeply interested in Yorkville because he grew up there. And will be with us tomorrow when we have kind of a jamboree of people, all of the speakers who've been with us this week, and then some additional people, including Ben. So I look forward to that. That'll be a little different. I also want to thank our acting executive director, Felicia Mayro, and Laura Sakine, who is our director of preservation and outreach. They have done a fabulous job both with content and, dear heaven, with the technical aspects of all of this, which is quite daunting to me, but they have it nailed. So many thanks to them. It gives all of us who are on the screen here great confidence. Lisa Ackerman will be our moderator again today, as she has been, as I said, the previous two, and also tomorrow. Professionally, Lisa is the executive director of the Columbus Citizens Foundation, which is an Italian-American heritage organization. Our speaker is Tony Wood. Both these people are, of course, preservationists, but professionally, Tony is a grant maker now with the Idelson Foundation. But let me just list a little bit quickly some of the other things that they do and have been. Tony started out in grant making with the Kaplan Fund, James Kaplan Fund, which was an absolutely essential early supporter of preservation organizations and preservation causes early in our law's history. I think many of you know that he has written a wonderful book called Preserving New York, Winning the Right to Protect a City's Landmarks. Lisa has been a New York State advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She's the chair of the Historic House Trust in New York City, and also a member of the of NIPAP, which Tony founded. All of this is to say that we preservationists have to stick together, and we do, and we network wonderfully, and we fight for each other's causes, and that is extremely important. Alas, I think, because there aren't enough of us, and I think we need to be more, but I think we make up for volume, perhaps, what we may not have in numbers. And that's really, I think, what we're going to be talking about today. Tony Wood is one of the city's, and in fact, the country's strongest, most perspicacious advocates out there. And so we're going to hear about community engagement and preservation from Tony and Lisa. All yours.
Thanks, Franny. Well, you know, some of us have been together since Tuesday. Looking at the people who've been coming into the Zoom room as Franny was talking, there are a wealth of people in the audience who know as much as Tony and I do about preservation in New York City, if not more. So I'm hoping that when we get to the Q&A, we'll have some lively discussions. And I mean, as Franny said, a lot of us in preservation met each other when we were starting out, and we've stuck together through thick and thin and had a variety of experiences that for me have only made me ever more fascinated in the history of New York City and the history of the streetscape. And in this particular instance with First Avenue Estate, it really makes you start to think about the dynamics of housing in the city. So we all live someplace, many of us live in apartments, And, you know, many of us, when we first graduated from college and came to New York City, although I didn't come from very far away because my parents were living here, but, you know, I lived on the fourth floor of a walk-up for 12 years. So a lot of us have had very visceral experiences about different kinds of housing in the city. So I think on Tuesday, we talked to Andrew Dolkart and had really a firm understanding of the cultural significance of First Avenue Estates, both when it was built and then as it evolved over time, and certainly through the landmark designation process and the subsequent battles to affirm that landmark designation. Yesterday with Will Cook, we walked through more of the intricacies of the legal elements and understanding where this fits into laws around multifamily dwellings, around zoning laws, and then really the almost kind of miraculous sense that when the landmarks law was written, it envisioned the need to be flexible and accommodate what would be a changing definition of what was worthy of preservation. And the fact that cultural significance was a factor in the landmarks law really allowed the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and others to really hold firm on why this complex of buildings needed to be designated and what it meant to the city. And I think underlying that was also an understanding that we still struggle today in some ways with many of the issues around affordable housing and quality of life issues in apartments that these buildings represented. So they represented a moment in time, but they also help us understand the world in which we live today. And I think one of the beauties of having 4 sessions is it allows us to go deeper than we normally might on each one of these topics. And so, Tony, with you, we're going to look at the community engagement, because none of this happens because one person writes a historic structures report and one person goes and testifies at the Landmarks Commission. In every one of these circumstances, but even more so in First Avenue, a very broad coalition of people came together to make this happen. So I think what we want to start off the conversation from your point of view is, you know, who were those initial main actors? And then as the struggle grew to nearly 200 community groups becoming involved, you know, what lit that spark that enabled people to really come together in a forceful coalition?
Well, the city in Suburban is actually a wonderful case study of community preservation advocacy because it both takes us through what it took to get these buildings designated. In one case, get it designated twice, and then the whole advocacy around the regulatory process of the commission and defending the commission and going through the whole hardship procedure. So you really get to see almost all potential aspects of preservation advocacy through this example. And as I think Andrew said in his program, when he talked a little about the history of how it got designated, the original interest was around the city and Suburban's York Avenue estate. And that then triggered the commission to consider both complexes of housing. And so the advocacy started with the threat to the city and Suburban's York Avenue estate. And when the news got out that that complex with its many units of affordable housing was going to be demolished, there was concern in many different communities about that. And the immediate community got together to figure out what course of action could be used to save those buildings, save that housing, and actually explored zoning remedies. They looked at all the possible toolkits and ultimately zeroed in on landmarks as the vehicle that could best protect the whole narrative of these buildings and give them a license into the future. So as that community conversation started, you know, as you said, there's no preservation victory is due to one person doing one thing, but there usually is a dynamo who kind of emerges as the orchestra leader, if you will, and helps pull those interested parties together and tenaciously sticks with the cause over time. So in this case, that was Betty Cooper Wallerstein, who helped put together the Coalition to Save City and Suburban Housing. And notice that housing, as you said, Lisa, is underpinning everything about this, is the existing housing, the history of representative housing reform and evolution that Andrew mentioned. And so when they decided to go down the landmark route, they built a very vast coalition. This was not an easy thing to get landmarked, either of these. It goes against what the basic approach that the commission and preservation had been taking, which was usually looking at something just through the lens of architectural beauty and architectural importance, even as you pointed out that the landmarks law allows things to be protected because of architecture, because of history, because of culture. So this was a stretch, an intellectual stretch, not a legal stretch, but an intellectual stretch to get the commission to appreciate these buildings, because usually the lens they look at was more architectural design. So it was a real lesson to educate the landmark world, the commission, about the importance. But the coalition grew because so many different sectors of interested people rallied around this because it resonated for them. So you had housing advocacy groups, you had planning groups, you had preservation groups, you had neighborhood groups, all coming together in this coalition and being willing to play the long game and go through all of the steps it takes, including hiring, getting the history of this really articulated. And so when you heard from Andrew, he didn't put up the copy of the wonderful book that he wrote that researched and began to make the case for the commission, why the commission should consider this, why it fit under the purview of the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the landmarks law. So both the architectural case was made, the cultural case, other experts were brought in, housing history experts. So you brought in the right kind of experts who could bring their knowledge to the field focused on this building. At the same time, there needs to be a constituency. The landmark process, by definition, has a political component. Whatever the Landmarks Commission does, ultimately then has to be, at that time, approved by the Board of Estimate, which was a political body, and today has to be approved by the City Council. So even though the commission itself doesn't take politics into consideration, still they need to know there is a constituency, there is a demand by the people of New York to save something. And that's where the community coalition of over 200 groups was so important, because that brings the politicians on board. That hopefully brings on the media on board. So you need to kind of have both the professional articulated case, which they had, but then also demonstrate that there was a significant commitment and community of folks who wanted to see both of these complexes saved.
So I'm going to stop you there for a moment, because I think this issue of politics also reminds me that we need to also turn back our minds a bit to what was happening in the city at that time. And at the time of most of this struggle, I worked on 80th Street near the corner of 3rd Avenue in a nondescript building that was late 19th century, where the Crest Foundation's offices were. But I walked around the neighborhood a lot in that era. And so we moved into that building in the end of 1984. And I would say from 1984 to 1994, I probably could not count the number of buildings that came down in the greater Upper East Side neighborhood at the time. And development is important. We live in a dynamic city. You need to accept that not everything is going to last forever, and buildings come and go, neighborhoods evolve. But there were some cruel things that happened in those years. There was a very interesting complex on 3rd Avenue in the 70s that had been built in the 1930s. Nobody would have gone to the mat for it architecturally, but it almost was built in a muse style, and everybody had access to their own green space, and there was an interior courtyard. Undoubtedly, it was important to let that building go and let the high rise go in its place because of the demand for housing. But I also think we have to remember that milieu in which a lot of us were seeing rapid changes in the neighborhood and fearing a little bit about what the future of the neighborhood was going to be. And hanging on to First Avenue Estate represented a lot of things, as we said on Tuesday, this very, very important breakthrough at the time in the concept of housing. But I think also, I'm wondering if some of what galvanized people was also a little bit of a fear that if we didn't take a stand at this moment, what was that going to mean for future battles, not just for landmarks, but for quality of life in the, greater Yorkville neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting is the effort to save these buildings did not come from card-carrying preservationists, right? It wasn't one of the usual crew, beating the drum and saying, we've got to save this. In fact, the usual preservationists, I will count myself among them at that time, didn't think this really had much of a chance of being saved but through the landmarks law, that it was going to be a very, very heavy lift. And I fortunately didn't share that opinion too widely with the leadership leading the effort, because in a sense, the people who didn't know you couldn't get this landmark were exactly the people who needed to get it landmarked. They didn't realize what they were up against, because the political pressure, sometimes in a landmark battle, you're fighting inertia, or there are just too many the commission's too busy. Here, you're also fighting a very, very powerful developer who owned a New York newspaper. And back to the politics, that's why the commission gets a lot of credit for their courage they showed. Usually when the Landmarks Commission, and you shouldn't say broad brush, but historically, when there was a building that the commission knew was going to come up under huge political pressure, the commission usually's attitude was not to walk in and designate it, right? I mean, they were not looking for trouble. They knew that there's a political component. They didn't want the Board of Estimate to get in the habit of turning back designations. That was something you really didn't want to have happen politically. So the commission to designate this, knowing that there was huge ownership opposition, well-financed, is really a testimony to their courage, because they knew this was going to be a heavy lift to get both of these complexes through the Board of Estimate final process. So lots of credit to the commission for, in a sense, realizing these buildings were so important that it was worth fighting for them, and maybe even worth losing them, because it wouldn't have been the commission saying they're not important. It would have been the politicians undercutting it. So it was a David Goliath battle. And once it got through the Landmarks Commission, when it got to the Board of Estimate and the backroom deal was made that cut out the buildings that ultimately were legally challenged at the York Avenue estate and put back in, when it came time for the community to decide, are we going to live with what the Board of Estimate did, the neighbors around the York Avenue estates said no. And back to Will's point yesterday on legally, they hired the best professional lawyers to take it on to the 6 figures. I mean, they had no money in the bank when they hired these lawyers. Fortunately, the lawyers didn't check their credit. But they went out and they raised that money up in an uphill battle using an Article 78, which is a kind of Hail Mary legal strategy, questioning the role of the Board of Estimate. Gutsy stuff, very, very gutsy stuff.
Well, and so that brings me to my next question. So very wrongly, New York preservationists can be accused of being narrow thinking, saber rattling kooks. And I of course know that that is categorically not true, but we're sweet, intelligent, open-minded people. But this was a very long and hard-fought battle. A lot of groups were invested, and really, it takes a lot to bring multiple groups together for common cause. And as you've said, there were political headwinds. The owner that they were fighting owned a newspaper, so could get his point of view out there easier than maybe a coalition of small nonprofits. So what were some of the strategies that enabled so many groups to stay focused through this long battle?
Well, we should also kind of cut the battle into two pieces. So what we've been primarily talking about is the battle to get it designated, which was extremely heavy lift, and then ultimately the battle challenging the Board of Estimates decision. And then there's the second battle, which we'll get to, the other legal battle. So I think it was tenacious leadership. I think there were larger principles involved here. I mean, people knew that these buildings were important in themselves, but they also stood for something. And as you say, it was kind of, there was the context of the neighborhood and where was New York going. But also I think it was a feeling that, you know, David versus Goliath. There are a lot of people who kind of resonate on the David side, you know, and it's kind of like, you know, if we're in it, I think the feeling was, I remember when the Board of Estimate made the deal and the alliance, the coalition had to decide whether they're going to legally challenge it in court on this Hail Mary pass was going to cost 6 figures. The conversation was basically, we need to know we left no stone unturned in trying to save this building. So I was like, you know, if we're going to lose it, we need to know we did everything we could in our power to use look, when the landmarks law was passed, it basically said, it is the city of New York values its history. It brings something to the city. And as a city policy, it's worth giving it protection, which is why we have a law. And it's the citizens of New York that really decide, you know, because Will was also saying on your call yesterday that, you know, in a sense, you've got to defend a law, right? If you don't use a law, if you don't defend a law, why have a law? And so I think that was part of the feeling. Now, the second piece, because I just wanted to segue a little into it. So after that designation battle happened and the buildings that had been cut out at the York Avenue estate were put back in, the legal case didn't include the buildings down that we're talking about mostly and celebrating today. So years pass, politics change, things change in New York. And again, there's this courageous feeling of we should right that wrong. We should get those designated. So there was now another designation effort that happened successfully. And then you had the legal challenges that the owner brought. Every potential legal challenge pretty much imaginable was used. And this is where the value of having what I call the architecture of the preservation community. So you've got community groups, you've got citywide groups, you've got national groups, and they all played a role in the multi-year effort. And Friends gets a lot of credit for this of, you know, usually the developer is the one with the deep pockets, right? Everyone, they're all being paid billable hours. Most of those on the advocacy side, you know, who aren't actually working for a group aren't. So in a sense, it's like, let's just run it out on those preservationists. Let's exhaust them. Let's appeal it again. Let's appeal it to all the courts, right? Let's push the hardship limit all the way and have it tested by the Supreme Court. So they were basically hoping to burn out, exhaust, bankrupt, scare off the preservation community. And the community stuck with it. And again, the commission gets a lot of credit for doing that. Friends gets a lot of credit. The National Trust came in. So in a sense, all the whole preservation apparatus was activated. And at that point, the issue was well beyond these buildings. It was now about the landmarks law, about the hardship provision of the law, defending that from challenge. So as I say, it's a wonderful example of preservation advocacy at all levels being brilliantly brought into play. And I think that also, back to Franny's introductory remarks, shows in a sense that there is this mutuality between groups and an understanding of what roles they play and being able to come in and play those roles when they're needed. And I think that really is well demonstrated here.
Well, that's great. And I couldn't agree more that this is really an example where David and Goliath is a good analogy, as well as the notion that a developer was hoping just to wear everybody out. And I think, you know, there have been a lot of times over the years when we've talked about the fact that there's more preservation groups in the city than you can count sometimes, because there's local advocacy groups. There's, of course, Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District. There's their counterparts in innumerable neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs. There's Historic Districts Council. There's New York Landmarks Conservancy. And this also was a case where all of the major groups really agreed early on the significance. And so, and then having affordable housing groups and other groups layer into the discussion, I think made it very interesting for a lot of people that it was one of those times where preservation really had the definition that we wanted to have, that it a very broad definition.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that because in this many-year saga, there was a moment where like-minded preservationists did part ways for part of this journey, which was very interesting. And it also shows on the kind of the different perspectives groups have to look through. So when the complexes were designated the first time and the Board of Estimate had turned back those buildings, it was the community and the coalition that decided to go with the Article 78, right? That troubled some of the citywide preservation groups because they were worried that that was going to create a political dynamic that was going to come back and hurt the preservation community later on. Because the power that the Board of Estimate had, that was going to be challenged in the Article 78, was being passed along to the City Council. So there was a worry that this would basically, in a sense, annoy future decision makers who would be looking at landmarks commissions. So the coalition went ahead despite the reservations of some of the citywide groups. And I think in a sense, everyone had the same set of values, but in that case, I think it was the citywide groups were worried about a precedent that was going to potentially hurt preservation into the future. The advocates who had led the fight from the beginning, their priority was saving these buildings and making sure no stone was unturned. So it was an interesting creative dynamic. That did not come up, to my knowledge, when it got to the second round, if you will, of the designation and then the legal challenges. So just, I add that in because it also shows that though the community has shared values, when it comes to strategies and how one looks at these things, occasionally there can be different perspectives and for good reasons.
Well, you're a great chronicler of the history of preservation of New York City, and you've also been involved with a number of preservation groups across the city. And, you know, I'm wondering, what lessons have you taken from the First Avenue estate saga? And as you've continued to work with preservation groups around the city, and you've also thought about where this fits in the pantheon of preservation battles, you know, what's in your mind as you approach new projects in the city?
Well, I think one of the key lessons, particularly for people who are professional preservationists or people who are kind of deeply in the field, is not to let the knowledge we have get in the way. And what I say that is, as I said, when the effort first started to save city and bourbon homes and get a landmark, it was such a wild card. It was such a long shot that people who were deeply steeped in preservation would have said, forget about it. And in fact, the cause was being driven by that coalition, that vast coalition of many groups that weren't preservation groups, had other different interests. So in a sense, they had a broader perspective and concern and didn't know that you couldn't get this thing preserved, right? And so one of the lessons I always take away, because I've now been in the trenches too long, I know what's not doable. So I think one of the lessons is when some group comes in, and says, we need to save this, and the professionals at MAS or HDC and the Landmarks Conservancy roll their eyes because they know better. We don't know better. And since this is a Friends of the Upper East Side call, another example of that is Helena Rosenthal, who was basically the founder of Friends and the kind of inspiration for years. She managed to get most of the Upper East Side rezoned after she got the designation of the historic district. And I remember conversations with her, And it was like, no, Helena, there's no way you can get it rezoned. She didn't know she couldn't get it rezoned. She got it rezoned. But once she got it rezoned, other neighborhood groups came to her and said, how do we get R8B zoning for our neighborhood? And she said, you can't do it, because she knew how hard it had been, right? So that's to me one of the takeaways we need to have, is particularly a lot of the energy comes from the locally focused group. So it wasn't any of the 3 citywide groups who said this needs to be saved and took the lead. It wasn't even Friends initially that took the lead. It was this coalition of diverse interests of people who were so upset that there had to, and decided there had to be a way to save these buildings and bring them into the future of New York.
Well, I think, you know, we've reached that point where I think we can make some final remarks and then turn it over to our audience for questions. But I'm going to end my remarks by saying that one of the things that's come up every night, or this is not night, afternoon today, the other 2 evenings, is that First Avenue Estate's not beautiful. And I, you know, made the comment that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I find the buildings striking because they are, you know, what makes the city interesting is that on the same block, you can have buildings that span 100 years. And part of the goal of preservation is not to put the city in amber, but to make sure we sort of have that march of history. And I think learning to look is also an important attribute of being a good preservationist, and kind of understanding that dynamic. And I think one important lesson for me years ago was that, of course, we're captivated by things that are obviously beautiful, but sometimes it's the most humble looking building that can hold the most history. And when I was a graduate student at Pratt, one of the things that I was assigned to was a studio in the Gowanus area in Brooklyn. And you suddenly walk around that neighborhood, vastly different today than when I was a graduate student, but you walk around and it's a collection of warehouses and housing that goes from 1900 to 3 minutes ago. But it's that interesting ability to almost tell all of American history by walking through a 10-block radius of the city. And that's true in all the boroughs. You can tell something about the agricultural history of the city because we still have Queens County Farm Museum to tell us that story. The Gowanus Canal, smallest of the commercial canals from the 19th century, but the most profitable because of where it was located. And so there's so much history embedded, and we're always going to miss something, we're always going to lose something. But I think part of the triumph of First Avenue Estate and its designation is not only does it preserve a streetscape in a specific neighborhood, but in a lot of ways, it's a reminder to us not to skip over something that can be humble looking on the outside, but really tell a rich story about an important era in our history. So for me, the joy of being with everybody this week has been that opportunity to look deeply into why this was culturally significant, why the court cases were so important. But in the long run, it's a reminder that we have to fight the good fight if we want the city to really reflect the full breadth of history and all the stories that can be told.
I'm glad you mentioned Gowanus, because we should give a shout out to the worthy people fighting today to try and protect Gowanus. So good effort, glad it came up. My takeaway, just to wrap this up, is to remind people that the landmarks is not a beauty contest in the traditional sense. In a sense, it's not if the building is pretty to you or to the landmarks commissioners themselves. If it is, it's a lot easier. You know, when you're trying to save St. Bart's, it kind of looks like a landmark. You know, it's kind of cuddly. You can hug it. It looks beautiful to most people. Fighting for Lever House was a little more difficult because it wasn't the traditional beauty, but it had architecture. But so landmarks law, it came out of 2 intellectual streams. One was the concern about beauty and aesthetics, and the other was one that cared about history and culture, right? And they came together in the law but it's always been the kind of traditional architectural beauty that historically kind of dominated it, because I mean, for many years, the whole staff was architectural historians, right? So that's kind of how you looked at it. But over time, that other aspect of the law has emerged. I would argue it still isn't as fully utilized as it should be in terms of recognizing, as you say, humble looking buildings with powerful stories that maybe even tucked behind the vinyl siding that's been put up over the Whitman house, right? So you're right. And I think part of the lessons of these battles is this was kind of an early example of going to the mat for buildings that you see the beauty in, but many people couldn't see any beauty in at all. And in a sense, they were designated for reasons of, yes, their design, but most, I think, in my mind, largely the cultural story, the moment in New York's history that they talk about. So they were kind of an early, wonderful example. And hopefully, we will, in 20 years, when people are talking about preservation, there won't be any discrepancy between how we approach buildings. And it won't be that hard to sell the cultural aspects. And I think there's been great progress made. The whole effort now lifting up the sites with LGBT history. Many of those, again, it's not the architecture that's driving that initiative, though that's a piece of it. It's primarily what's the story that building tells us today.
Well, that's a great way to end. I'm going to thank everybody for joining us, particularly those people for whom this is day 3. I'm going to invite everybody who wants to stay for the Q&A to turn their video on. And I'm going to ask Laura to come back. There she is. And be our Q&A interpreter, I guess.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for inviting people to turn their videos on. We have over 40 people here. Would love to see your beautiful faces while we have this conversation. We do have very interesting questions from our audience today. And I'm going to start. Does the designation of these buildings lead to more landmarks with this kind of history, but not standard beauty? And if so, what are those buildings? What are they?
Well, I think they already have led to that. The designation of these, I mean, really lifted up the history of housing as a theme that the commission should look at as it looks at buildings, as it does its surveys. So I think that helped lift that up. Lisa, I'm gonna punt to you to look into the future, in terms of whether you see these helping get some of the buildings I know that you're fond of in Brooklyn and others. Will this help? I think it helps without a doubt.
Well, I
can't
think,
come up with a list.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is a push from within the field for a broader history to be told. So as Tony says, the LGBTQ sites are one example where there's really now a concerted effort to look at those sites. Certainly with everything we're seeing going on across the country today with Black Lives Matter and with call for greater social equity. I also think for many, many years, a coalition of major foundations have been pushing people across all disciplines to think more broadly about what story is being told. And I teach in the Pratt program, and if you take the pulse of the students today, I think students are asking tougher questions. And I think certainly my experience, and Laura is probably perfectly qualified to answer this question as well, since she was not so long ago a graduate student. I think in general, students are coming through programs like the preservation program and already have a tougher set of standards than we did when we were in graduate school. I'm not saying that we were passive people that just accepted what professors told us, but because I think, some of us asked questions, but you were more inclined to just accept at face value some of what was being told to you. And I think graduate students today, and probably undergraduate students too, I just don't teach undergraduates, but I think, they're pushing that envelope. So they're going to be the future decision makers. So if they're coming through already with a strong consciousness about we're not telling full enough stories, eventually they'll be in those decision-making seats, helping to, open up our minds more to what needs to be preserved and also how we preserve it. I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal today that we didn't have not so long ago. So you can telegraph out great stories through web and social media vehicles that we couldn't do before. You were dependent on writing a paper, giving a talk, publishing a book. And now I think there's a lot of ways to get more information out to people about what matters.
Actually, the history of preservation does show there's a real generational dimension. So, the people who pushed for the landmarks law originally, many of them would roll over in their grave when they saw the modernist buildings that scared them to death being designated as landmarks. And so as generations move, not only do understandings change, but what they regard to be historic. So when I had a student years ago at Columbia come in and say he was going to focus on Levittown, that was of interest because that was their sense of history, in terms of a moment that meant something. And so I think each generation actually helps, which underscores, Lisa, the point you made earlier about the part of the brilliance of the landmarks law is it didn't define in specific terms what a landmark was. They could have said it's got to be Beaux-Arts, it's got to be a particular style. Instead, the definition of what a landmark is basically is whatever the sitting Landmarks Preservation Commission determines it to be. It's a little glib, but not too much actually. And so that allows change so that, Victorian buildings, Art Deco buildings, 1950s buildings never would have been appealing to the people, the tastes of those who wrote the law, but they realized that the law needed to be flexible to reflect changing needs, as you pointed out earlier, Lisa.
Tony, you mentioned that in the beginning, preservationists weren't hopeful when this fight started. When did your confidence change and what caused it to change?
A number of factors. One was the growing extent of the coalition of groups that were brought together. So the fact that there was a growing constituency, so that was going to help on the political side. As experts were brought in to talk about the importance, as Andrew did his work, Plunz, a great housing historian, did a piece. So as the case was being made, that made a big difference. David Todd, the chairman through some of this, actually was very personally interested, informed, and knowledgeable about the history of housing. So you had an ear there. So, kind of all of these pieces came together. I'd say though, the first worry was, would the Landmarks Commission designate it? And that began over time as the evidence was piled up. And as, if you will, the other side, as Andrew pointed out in his talk, they produced all these reports trying to say why the building wasn't important. But actually in the process, they stirred up a lot of good information about why it was important. So that balance began to shift so that I began to think there was a chance the commission would designate it. That, however, was not the whole ballgame. Then the question was, could you get the Board of Estimate to put it together? And the bottom line was there was a backroom deal made that kind of allowed certain politicians to look good by taking a position knowing that it wouldn't be the dominant position. So in a sense, they could say, oh, I voted the right way, knowing that enough votes weren't there. So that was, we were worried until we lost those buildings at the Board of Estimate the first time. Then the next leap of faith was, would an Article 78, and anyone who knows that is the last act of desperation legally available to you, because it's basically saying a government body isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And the courts always defer to the body that's being questioned. So once we went down that path, that was just a leap of faith from day one till ultimately the court came down on our side after many steps.
You've talked extensively about how it was a difficult fight for the community to get it designated in the first place and to reverse that. So if a community is interested in preserving their community, a building or something, are there any other tools other than designation?
Yes, yes. I mean, there are a lot of tools out there. In fact, in the City and Suburban case, the first thing they looked at was trying to get a zoning change that would have kind of made it not possible to do the high-rise development. So, I mean, if you're an advocate, there are a lot of different avenues to look at. Preservation for years was seen as perhaps one that was more receptive than, say, working through the planning process. I think that's changed over the years, but there are planning tools, there are preservation tools. There's sometimes the ability to directly intervene in the real estate market. Not often possible in New York City, but potentially. There are environmental reviews sometimes that can be brought into play. Kind of, you never know what the wild card may be. I remember one fight where they were trying to get the, whatever, I'm blanking on the Aviation Commission federally to stop a high rise because it was going to be in the flight path of planes. So you've got to get really, I mean, if you're a really good community activist, you don't think in the box. You don't look at it like I'm just a preservationist. It's like I'm saving that thing. What tool can I find? Is there a snail darter, floating around, and that was what helped with Westway? Is there an environmental impact? Is there a human impact? You've got to be very creative. You've got to be tenacious, and you've got to be like a dog with a bone. And you've got to dedicate a significant chunk of your life to this, which you don't tell that person at the beginning, because otherwise they'd run in the other direction screaming.
Well, fortunately, we're all still here, as is our audience. So I'm going to thank everybody once again for being with us. I'm going to remind everybody that if they're free at 1 o'clock tomorrow, we're bringing Andrew Dolcart, Will Cook, and Tony Wood back with some special guests from the community. And we'll have a wonderful conversation with a broader group of people, and hopefully some pithy and witty final remarks to end our week. And again, it's so great to see everybody, and look forward hopefully to seeing many of you tomorrow. Bye-bye.